many live from Suriname, many live in the Netherlands. So it became gradually a sort of powerful concept, for example, in Dutch international policy of cultural cooperation, mutual heritage. There's a lot of mutual heritage, whether or not connected with slavery. This is mutual heritage, not just of the Netherlands and Brazil. It is a castle in a fortress in Recife, but also connected with Portugal. So it's part of the heritage of Portugal as a colonial power, it's part of the heritage of the Netherlands as a colonial power, and it's part of the history, of the heritage of Brazil. So it's an interesting example of mutual heritage, heritage from different countries, different stories that come together here. But does mutual heritage automatically mean shared heritage? It can be mutual, it can be part of different heritage complexes, but do we feel that as something that we share? And I must admit that most of the Dutch people do not perceive this as part of shared heritage, because most of the Dutch people are not interested in the history of Brazil, and they do not consider that as something they have a sort of intrinsic responsibility for. A nice example of a new, oh, I am so sorry. A nice example of how we can develop this idea from mutual heritage to shared heritage is this showcase in Dutch city of Halberstadt. It is not relevant, but in well, not far from Halberstadt, there was a huge battle between Prussian army and French army, and they made this diorama of this battle. I don't want to go too much in details, but it was a sort of mutual heritage. Yeah? This battle, there were Prussian soldiers and there were French soldiers. So it was part of French history and part of German history. And the museum in Halberstadt, the German museum, looked for a contact in France. And it was, I must say, it was a battle in France. It was not in the time of Napoleon, it was 1871. The battle took place in France. So they contacted the museum, the local museum, near the battlefield. And together they developed a program, how to deal with the battle. In the perspective of, well, war is not very good, and we should have friendship instead of fight. So I think that is very, very interesting, that you can go beyond this ancient tension between two countries, because there's still tension between France and Germany, and to overcome it and work together as professionals to see if you can develop a joint project, a project in Halberstadt and in Germany, and a project in France. I think it's a very nice example that it's very simple means, and you can transform something into well, a feeling of, well, we have a shared responsibility. But it's complex, it's complex. This is Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is a concentration camp, as you know, where many Jews and Gypsies and others were being killed. It is a German, a fascist German concentration camp. It used to be part of Germany, well, until 1945. Now it's a part of Poland. Now, whose heritage are we talking about? Is this Polish heritage? Because now it's Poland. Is it German heritage? Because once it was Germany and it was built by the Germans. is this mutual heritage? This is shared heritage. The people from Poland, they refused to accept this concept of mutual heritage here. And they said, oh, this is not ours. This is not our heritage. It's the heritage of them, the fascists. But it's not always so very simple. But if you can find a sort of solution, then I think you overcome old sort of dilemmas, tensions, and come to something new. And that new may also be in what we have called musealization light. And see if I have time. Yeah. This is a nice example, I think, of what we call musealization light. In the 1990s, you know, they had a huge epidemic of AIDS. Yeah? Many people were victims of AIDS, and if you use the term victim, people that are dying of AIDS, but also their friends and relatives. And to commemorate the victims of AIDS, groups of people made quilts. It was a tradition that started in the United States and was adopted in the Netherlands, for example. And the right hand side of the slide, you see installation with a lot of quilts commemorating people that died, made by their relatives, friends. So in this, especially in the gay community, those quilts are extremely important. But fortunately, AIDS, at least in the Netherlands, is not so much a problem as it used to be. It's still a problem, but it's less a problem than it used to be. And this whole idea of continuously talking about the victims of AIDS, well, those victims, they died a long time ago. You know, they still need to be commemorated, but still there is not so much a community who could take care of these memorial quilts. So what to do with that? And so a group of activists decided that perhaps they should donate those quilts to museums, but in a different way, taking this idea of stewardship almost literally. And in 2014, the Museum Europäische Kulturen, the Museum of European Cultures in Berlin, acquired one of these quilts. And they acquired these quilts because it added a dimension to their quilt collection. They have a large textile collection, they have a lot of quilts. This is also a quilt, a more contemporary quilt, and it is adding a sort of social history dimension, which we desperately need. And here you see the mother of this AIDS victim, who partly was responsible for making this quilt, sharing his feeling and the story of making this quilt with the community of the object. And in this contract, the community has always access to this object without gloves. Yeah? So it is perceived as being their heritage, and the museum has a responsibility to take care of that, to use it in an appropriate museum way. But whatever the museum does, it always has to be done together with the community. So in fact that is exactly the same as the principles principles as described in this document of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. This stewardship, shared stewardship of collections must be conducted in the spirit of consultation and collaboration. So it's not just about indigenous people, but it's a more general sort of principle. It can refer to any sort of group, any community. Initial consultations with cultural custodians and community-based archival repositories will be conducted in person, whenever practical, to provide a proper opportunity for the center and community to harmonize their expected obligations and responsibilities. Source communities, so the communities of origin, share authority for collection and associated documentation. Their guidance and so on is important, which is what we call musealization light. It is a form of musealization, but it is a musealization in which the people that donate this object, or people that are the creators of this object, still are involved in the decision making process. And if you allow me to give another example from this ethnological museum in Leipzig, today they have a group of elders from an Aboriginal community from Australia, where we're discussing these sort of things, restitution and the shared heritage sort of notion. And what the museum is now trying to develop is to create special spaces in the museum where this interaction between the source community and the objects in the collection can take place. So where rituals can be developed and whatever is involved with that. So it has far-reaching consequences, and it can and should be made part of the educational program of the museum. Perhaps not by giving people the right to participate in these ceremonies when they are secret and cultural sensitive and all, but this notion of stewardship, responsibility is important to communicate. But in the end, of course, it can mean that visualization light is a part of restitution and return, and that you accept this stewardship, but say, well, stewardship does not necessarily mean that we have it. Stewardship can also mean that they have it. So that connects with this idea of restitution and return. Discussion very much started with a Jewish heritage, which was stolen from Jewish owners, collectors by the Nazis. And from the 1990s we have this discourse to what extent this former Jewish property should be restituted to them or to people that are related to them. And many museums, all museums in fact in the Netherlands, many museums in Germany, France, United Kingdom, United States, they have analyzed their inventories from the 1930s onwards to see if objects in their collection may have been part of collections of former Jewish owners. And now the perspective shifts a little bit to stolen Jewish heritage to colonial heritage. And the same principles are being applied here. This two versions of an important document in Germany, a guideline to study the provenance of artifacts from a colonial past, and to understand how these objects came into German collections, and to see how these strategies of musealization can be implemented. The most famous report recently was published by these two people, and that was asked by President Macron. It has been extremely influential. It is saying, well, there is so much colonial heritage in European and American museums, and what should we do with that? Looking at Africa, there's more heritage from Africa, African origin in Europe and the United States than in Africa itself. So this is an imbalance as a result of colonialism. We should address this imbalance. And yes, they say yeah, there is a shared element in it. Colonialism, yeah, shared history, a shared element in it, but recognizing the fact that it is shared, does that automatically mean that it should be preserved in European museums? But why not in African museums? So there you have the context of restitution, and it starts usually with human remains. Here you see the director of the Ethnographical Museums of Saxony signing a document with an elder of an Aboriginal community for returning a lot of bone material to ancestors. Yeah? And the term is to rehumanize these materials. I think that's a beautiful term. The bones, they were collected as anthropological research objects. They were dehumanized. They were objects. They were used in studies of evolution and whatever. And now the museums realized that what we could and what we should do is to rehumanize these objects and to bring these ancestors back to the communities of origin. Here you see how these objects are being shipped to Australia and welcomed by the community of origin. But a restitution, return, new use or musealization can, not a few minutes, can also have other forms, perhaps more controversial forms, because this is well adopted and well accepted sort of policy. Maybe not all the museums do it in a way that we would like to see it, but it is hardly controversial. But there are other ways, I think, we can deal with this sort of issues, other strategies of new musealization. One of the most controversial initiatives is the foundation of disinherited goods. Foundation started in 2012, starting from collections that are being deaccessioned. Some museums are being closed in the Netherlands, and what to do with the collections. Some museums want to rationalize their collections, and they want to get rid of part of their collection. What to do? But now this foundation is taking care of it. And this foundation is advocating a sort of public, a real public ownership of these collections. So you, whether Dutch or perhaps also somebody in Colombia, I don't know, but you can have one of these. Okay, you can. There's a website, and you can check the website and say, "Oh, it's an object what I would like to have," and then you do not buy it, but you adopt it. And there's a certificate, there's see, I signed the certificate, I adopted an object. An object for museum collection, museum didn't want to have it, but why should it be destroyed? The object can still be interesting and relevant for me. So the idea is that I adopt this object, and that I become sort of steward. Yeah? That I, for a certain amount of time, I become responsible for the conservation or whatever of this object. But this idea is brilliant. It is really sharing a responsibility for heritage. It's spreading the responsibility. Because we are not talking about paintings by Rembrandt. Yeah? Of course, they are simple objects. But still, the principle is there. The principle is there that there may be other forms of musealization. That it's not my heritage, indirectly, because it's Dutch, so indirectly it's my heritage, but I have now a special personal relation to these objects. But I think it's an interesting object that appeals to me, and for the time being I would like to be responsible for it. But of course it can extend to people that are really related to that. And in the break, I was talking to one of you about memories. Well, it is a well-known sort of story that, of course, it's not necessary to collect all memories or objects related to memories of all sorts of communities in one big national museum. You can have either a network of local museums, or you can accept the fact that heritage is among the people whose heritage it is. And well, that's a principle that also goes back to the discussion about eco-museums in the early 1970s. Eco-museums framework for that, originally intended as a framework for that. People take care of their own heritage, but share it with others through documentation and other ways. So this is then something that we now discuss in terms of the liquid museum. And that is a term that appeals to me, to us very much. And the liquid museum. A term comes from Zygmunt Bauman, a Polish philosopher, sociologist, and taken over by an Australian geologist, Fiona Cameron. The liquid museum. A new institutional ontology for a complex and uncertain world. There are a lot of text slides now, but perhaps I can make a deal with William that I sent him a PDF version of my PowerPoint presentations, so you can read these texts yourself and see my co-authorization attempt makes sense. The idea of the modernist museum, where I started with the dominant image of the museum from the early 19th century onwards, based on hierarchy. Yeah? An enclosed space, a building, an exhibition, rationality, scientific, political, whatever. It's a way, a static way of how to perceive the world. And the liquid museum attempts to be the opposite. And the liquid museum tends to find solutions and is more or less accommodating different diversity of worldviews, because the heritage should not be stored away in huge static museums. It should be spread, as I referred to before, and should be a living part of these communities. And I was so happy to speak to some of you and to see that these ideas are floating around and being implemented here in this country already. I'm looking forward to visiting this country again and then make a trip around all these sort of heritage initiatives. I think it very much connects with this idea of liquid museum, and I hope the students, one of you will write a master thesis or a PhD about this, and starting from this idea of Cameron, Fiona Cameron, connected with this experiences here, because I think that's extremely relevant in our attempts to validate the concept of museum. And basically, it's also about this new proposed definition. There's some continuity between this definition, between the practices here, with these different memories, and this idea of more theoretical idea of liquid museum. So I think we have a lot of work to do. There are a lot of things that